Hello and welcome back to Daddy Rolled a One. I'm Martin, and this is another video in my series on the history of early tabletop role-playing games, including Dungeons & Dragons, and one of the companies that published them, Tactical Studies Rules, and its later descendant company, TSR Hobbies. Today we're going to be talking about ability scores or attributes. So why do we have attributes in role-playing games? Where do they come from? And how do we end up with the 6 that we have in Dungeons & Dragons? Why those 6? How ability scores have impacted characters over time. Ability scores used to be much less important than they are now. And then I'm going to talk about a few other games, some that came out right after D&D, and then some modern games to just talk about why ability scores might change. And we don't always use the standard 6 that D&D set as the precedent. So before I dive in, I'd like to ask if you could please like and subscribe to this video. The YouTube algorithm really depends on likes and comments to help recommend my videos to other people. I'm a smaller channel, so the more likes and comments and subscriptions I get, the more I'm likely to be seen by other people. So if you enjoy this, I would really appreciate your help. Also, if you want to help support me, you can buy a little something from my shop. There's links below. You can get shirts, hoodies, notebooks, mugs, posters with exclusive designs from a designer that I work with, a friend of mine, that you can only find in my shop. Okay, ability scores. So let's talk about, where do ability scores in role-playing games come from? What was the idea of putting them in there? Well, you might not be surprised if you're a fan of history and my history videos of early tabletop role-playing games. They do come from war games. So D&D and role-playing games, the genre of that was an offspring of miniature war games. So we're talking about Napoleonic miniatures, which is what the crew that helped develop Dungeons and Dragons were normally playing. There's a bunch of different styles, but the idea of this is that you have different units of troops that have to have a different strength score, a speed score, a morale score, just as an example. Okay, those are 3 very common ones. And you needed to be able to compare these units of troops so that you knew when they went up in battle who's going to win based on their numerical value that's assigned to that particular unit of troop. Okay, so Gary Gygax would have been very familiar with this concept. He loved a war game that came out, particularly in 1958 by Avalon Hill, called Gettysburg. So that game does have like strength scores for units, and infantry versus cavalry is different, right? So almost like a character class as an example, but it has morale, okay, which is very important to war games, but also early tabletop role playing games. So Gary has this war game. Now, another thing that war games have in common, a lot of them do, is the idea of saving throws. So saving throws, a term predates Dungeons and Dragons. It goes all the way back to at least 1962. There's a book called War Games. And the idea is very similar to what it is today. You're rolling to avoid a negative consequence. Now, the reason I bring up saving throws in a video about ability scores is because in the early days, they were kind of intertwined. Characters and players and referees didn't necessarily distinguish one from the other. So you were rolling to avoid a negative consequence. That's your saving throw, but it might say like, roll to save versus dexterity or roll to save versus constitution. Just like if you're a 5e player today, that's how ability scores and saving throws are handled. However, saving throws were not always tied to specific ability scores in the history of a game. That's actually a pretty modern concept in 5e, but it goes all the way back to these war games that helped influence the creation of Dungeons and Dragons. So a couple of other war games that we should talk about. One is Hyboria, 1957. It's a play-by-mail game. Now, this is not a game that you would go buy at a store and then bring home, learn how to play, and start playing. This is a campaign that is living, and it's between players who are playing by mail. And so the game is evolving based on the needs of the players and the referees at the time. Okay, so what would happen in this was that over time, things would change and evolve. So we know that this game didn't necessarily have attribute scores. However, there's an article or a letter written by one of the creators of the game, Tony Bath, where he talks about drawing playing cards and doing so in order to distinguish between some attributes or abilities or personality traits, really, for different players. So you might be like attractive and cowardly, or you might be ugly and loyal, or things like that. So different ways of viewing characters and playing their attributes up, playing their personality up. However, these are binary. There's no numerical score, and you're not comparing them to anybody else because no one has the same attributes. You're drawing cards to see what you get, and then you're using that to influence how you're going to run that character. Now, this is not a role-playing game, but you're starting to see role-playing elements come into this, okay? Later on in 1970, Tony Bath writes an article in a magazine called Slingshot where he talks about needing to have a numerical score of 1 to 5 for different attributes for your character, such as loyalty or ability, okay? So again, we're starting to see these kernels of what we would consider to be ability scores and role-playing in general come out of these types of games. However, it is still a war game. It is not a role-playing game. It's just starting to exhibit elements of role-playing. Another game is Braunstein. If you've watched my videos before, you know Braunstein. So this is a war game run by Dave Wesley in the Twin Cities area, but it has ability scores, or I'm sorry, it has it's a game where you have a character, a pre-gen character that has an objective. However, it's not campaignable. So it's not, your character's not necessarily developing over time. You show up one session, you have a certain set of objectives and a pre-gen character. You show up the next time and you have a different character and a different objective. Okay. So, but that's how he's running that game. However, you have 2 descendant games coming out of that. The first is Brownstone. This is by a man named Dave Jenkins, the second of our 4 Daves that we're going to be talking about. And he develops a Wild West version of Braunstein. However, his game is campaignable. Characters are developing over time. You're using the same character game to game. Now, while neither Braunstein or Brownstone, the consensus is they did not have attribute scores the way that we think of them today. When you have a campaignable game where your character is developing over time, it's just natural to assume that their personality is also going to develop. And that personality is what we could kind of consider being part of attribute traits, right? So you have Brownstone, Dave Jenkins. Then our third Dave Arneson, he runs a Braunstein game. And that one's kind of fun because we have this very early artifact. I found this on the Playing at the World blog. And this is, there's also a book. This is by a gentleman named John Peterson. And he found this character sheet it's now known as the Royal Spanish. So this is a list of people that belong to the Spanish family. This is for a Napoleonic Braunstein game. But you see these traits listed here, which are brains, looks, sex appeal, or it just says sex, guts, health, and miscellaneous. This is a 2d6 roll. Okay, so you're going to generate a score from 2 to 12. And what they would do is roll a d12. And if you rolled over your score in one of these, it meant you didn't succeed or there's a negative consequence. So this is, again, we're starting to see this idea of having a randomly generated score for a list of traits that should be technically the same list of traits for everybody who's playing this game. Okay, so this is his Braunstein game. Then he decides to run a medieval Braunstein game, is how he advertises it. It later becomes known as Blackmoor. He changes the name. But in Blackmoor, we're going to have 2 different character sheets here. So the first is by Dave Megarry. So this is our 4th Dave. And this is his sheet, his copyright. I found this on the Secrets of Blackmoor documentary's website. If you're at all interested in the history of early tabletop role-playing games, please check out the Secrets of Blackmoor documentary. I'll put a link to that in the show notes below. So this is his character sheet. And here you see this litany of abilities that he's got: brains, leadership, woodcraft, strength, courage, health, loyalty, looks, sex, miscellaneous, horsemanship, flying, throwing, sailing, and then weapons. Okay, weapon proficiencies. So as a modern player, we're looking at this and saying he's mixing 3 different things together. But the reason is because they didn't distinguish between these things. This was just a suite of things that their character could do with a randomly assigned numerical score to that so that they can compare it to other players, or when the referee asked them to roll die to figure out if they succeeded or something. So again, these early ideas of what we were going to start calling attribute scores in role-playing games. I talked about these being living campaigns, though, without a specific set of rules being written down. You see here the next sheet. This is for another player named Pete Gaylord. This is his wizard character. And if you flip the character sheet over, you see that he has his list of abilities are personality, brains, looks, credibility, sex, health, strength, and courage. Now, sex keeps coming up. Why is this? Again, this is sex appeal. The idea was that the characters in these games sometimes might want to have made alliances with other people through marriage. So they're going to make overtures to them as their character, or maybe one of their characters has a son or daughter that they want to marry off to a son or daughter of another character. And so you needed to know how that overture is going to be received based on how suave and charming you were or your sex appeal. Okay. So Arneson takes this game, his Blackmoor game. He incorporates a few elements from Chainmail. This is the fantasy supplement for Chainmail. However, there are no ability scores in here. Each character, the only abilities that they really have are a morale rating and a point value. Okay, so, but Dave Arneson takes his game to Gary Gygax. Gary takes that game, works with Dave Arneson, and they create Dungeons and Dragons, the first commercially available, published, and distributed role-playing game that you could like go to the store and buy. Okay, so this is the first one. So hence, we're going to have our first list of official ability scores in a role-playing game. This is the list. Strength, intelligence, wisdom, constitution, dexterity, and charisma. That's the original order that they were listed in. Now, if you notice here, charisma affects your minimum number of hirelings or your maximum and their loyalty base. Constitution affects your hit points a little bit. Dexterity affects your rate of missile fire, whether you're good at it or bad. But that's it. Notice that strength, intelligence, and wisdom don't do anything, except if you have high strength and you're a fighter, if you have high intelligence, you're a magic user, and you have high wisdom and you're a cleric. If it's high, you get a bonus to your experience points. That's what ability scores were for in this version of the game. So if you had a fighter and you were strength 6 or strength 18 in this game, doesn't matter. It makes no impact on your character, except if you've had an 18, you get a bonus to your ability scores. Okay, so that's the list of ability scores. How do we end up with this 6? Why this 6 of ability scores? Well, Gary Gygax is born in 1938. He writes in the Appendix N for the Dungeon Master's Guide, see my video here, that he consumed copious amount of comic books as a kid, and that influenced him when he was creating Dungeons and Dragons. The most popular character by far in the 1940s in comic books was Captain Marvel, or what we would now call Shazam. He debuts after Superman, but quickly eclipses him in the hearts and minds of little kids and becomes the most popular character. Now, if you're familiar at all with Shazam, you know that his abilities are the wisdom of Solomon, the strength of Hercules, the stamina or constitution of Atlas, the power of Zeus, the courage of Achilles, and the speed, maybe dexterity, of Mercury. So I have no proof of this. I don't know that Gary Gygax ever read a Captain Marvel comic book, and he's passed away. We can't ask him. It's never been documented anywhere else. I just think it's really funny that we have 6 ability scores here, and 4 of these 6 are the same 4 of the 6 of Shazam. Okay, so again, it could just be a complete coincidence. Obviously, Dave Arneson's making a list that doesn't match this really at all, and Gary was influenced by that. It's just that, he condensed it, and I just think it's coincidental that he condensed it to 6. He takes looks, sex appeal, and personality, puts it into charisma, a big word. He takes health, changes that to constitution, another big word, because why? Gary likes his high Gygaxian, as I talked about in my Dungeon Master's Guide. All right, so you have those 6 ability scores. Really quick here. Referees roll the characters in this particular game. Prior to the character selection by players, it is necessary for the referee to roll 3 6-sided dice in order to rate each as to the various abilities. Really quickly, this in order. Everybody thinks that this just means you roll them in the order that it was. So you roll 3d6 for your strength, then you roll 3d6 for intelligence, then for wisdom, etc. I think that's what it meant. However, this is written so poorly that in order to could mean as a means to. You need to do this in order, as a means to figure this out. And then you could assign them however you want it. Now, it doesn't say you can assign them however you want. It's just not clear. The wording in this is not clear. And if you were new to the game back then trying to read that, I think you'd have a really hard time figuring out what he was trying to say. All right. So that is original D&D. Then in 1975, you have the supplement published, Greyhawk. Now we see Gary is assigning values to strength. If you're a fighter, you get a bonus to hit and damage for your high strength. And then magic users, now intelligence affects your chance to learn a new spell and how many spells you're going to get. And then he adds some details here on constitution. So Gary's starting to say that ability scores are more important than just for gaining experience points. However, in 1977, the Holmes edition of Basic comes out and it backtracks. It goes back to not really assigning a different ability score bonuses and penalties. He goes back to original D&D. However, in 1978, Gary creates the Player's Handbook for Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. And here you see that ability scores do have a lot of different bonuses and penalties. So Gary goes back to kind of saying that like ability score is important. And in fact, in the Dungeon Master's Guide for Advanced D&D, he talks about different methods for rolling ability scores in order to generate higher than average scores, because he says that your players need to have higher than average scores in Advanced D&D. And that is the start of now this idea that like if you're playing a fighter character and you don't have a 20 strength in 5th edition, well, you're not optimized. You know, if you're playing a 14 strength, that's not optimized and your character's not effective. Okay. That didn't used to be the case. Let's talk about some other games then. 1975, we have the release of Empire of the Petal Throne, also by TSR. This game mechanically is very, very similar to D&D. However, ability scores here, wisdom is now psychic ability for this game, and charisma is comeliness. If you want to know more about comeliness, watch my video on Unearthed Arcana. Okay. So this game, however, very mechanically similar to D&D. So the scores, it's 6 scores on a range of 3 to 18. 3d6, okay? But then also 1975, you have the release of Boot Hill. Also by TSR. This is a Wild West game, however. And it's a role-playing game, but it's really more about one-to-one like gunfights. It's gunfight combat. So the ability scores reflect that. Speed, gun accuracy, throwing accuracy, strength, bravery, and experience, how many gunfights you've been in before. Okay, so system matters. The mechanics in this game are completely different because they are trying to model a different experience. This is not about exploration, and you'll see there's no social skills in here. There's no charisma. There's nothing like that. This game isn't about that. Okay, so the mechanics of the game changed. So I know if you're a 5th edition player, you might just be very familiar with the mechanics and say like, oh, any genre can be adapted to D&D. It can. It totally can. And in the 3.5 edition, I did that all the time. There were games for, spies and post-apocalyptic cyberpunk, science fiction, superheroes, Wild West, ran the gamut, all shoehorning it into an existing system that was just super popular at the time. However, the more time has gone on, the more I've realized that, like, again, the mechanics matter. The system matters because it's designed to emulate a different type of experience. So just something to think about. So some other games that we have here, just to show that example some more, you have Star Frontiers, also by TSR. This is released later. Okay, but the ability scores here: strength, stamina, dexterity, reaction speed. You have initiative, intuition, logic, personality, and leadership. Completely different list of skills. Then we have Marvel Superheroes, one of my favorites. Came out in 85, I believe. So this is known as the Face Rip system because the ability scores here: fighting, agility, strength, endurance, reason, intuition, and psyche. So those are your ability scores, and they're rated on a scale of feeble all the way up to class 1000 and all these fun descriptive words in between. So completely different system, different mechanics based on modeling comic book superheroes. Another game, I have a whole video on this, but this is Savage Worlds. So this is a modern game. So the ability scores here, flip to the right page. So we have agility, smart, spirit, strength, and vigor. So that's for this game, okay? You've also got like the Forged in the Dark system and their ability scores. That's based on 3 different ones, okay? So different games, different mechanics for emulating different kinds of things. All right, so that is our look at ability scores for a quick history of ability scores in tabletop role-playing games. All right, so I'm going to add in my little bit that I was talking about last time. What was I drinking while I was working on making this video? My notes. Well, this is Angel's Envy. Sadly, it's almost gone. But this is a bourbon whiskey aged in port wine barrels. I just had a little snifter here. It was quite delicious. Served that to my dad on Father's Day. And I was listening to this record. This is Art Blakey and the Jazz Messengers at the Jazz Workshop. It's, just 5 different, standards. I really like jazz, as you'll find out if you keep watching, and I keep showing my videos or my records. So that's it for watching for this video. So I'd like to say thank you for watching, and happy gaming. Stay safe, and I'll talk to you next time.